Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 13 of the class. Last summer, when I was designing the course and looking ahead to the calendar, I realized that this would be Thanksgiving week, and so I was interested in doing something a little fun, maybe a little bit lighter. And it was baseball season at the time, and so I decided that we would talk about a baseball story this week. So I called it "The World's Greatest Leader: A Case Study," and the story is really about mostly about Theo Epstein, who's the general manager of the Chicago Cubs. And what got my attention about a year ago, a little over a year ago, was the fact that Fortune magazine named him. They did a series on the 50 greatest leaders in the world, and Theo Epstein came out number one on their list of the greatest leader on the planet. And so I thought that was really intriguing that a business magazine would pick a baseball executive for that sort of an honor. And as I read the basically the justification, about the same time, discovered that a book came out called The Cubs Way, uh, subtitled "The Zen of Building the Best Team in Baseball and Breaking the Curse." Um, Tom Verducci, the author, had spent the entire 2016 season with the Cubs, um, and basically wrote chronicled the turnaround of the Cubs, all the way from 2012 when Epstein went there to be their general manager through their winning of the World Series in 2016. And so, as I read the Fortune magazine article and I read this book, especially thinking about what happened in the context of strategy and leadership, I thought this was a really interesting case study for us to talk about. Whether you're a baseball fan or not, I think there's some nice lessons in not only the strategy but the execution of strategy. And so, wanted to take you through that a little bit this week. The reading that I have posted on Moodle is one chapter out of the Cubs Way. That Cubs Way is the name of basically the strategic plan or the strategy that they crafted in 2012. And so the chapter is really about what that strategy was about, how it was put together. The reference to breaking the curse, one of the reasons that Fortune magazine named Theo Epstein the best leader in the world was that he actually broke two curses. The first one was with the Boston Red Sox. And so I've known of Theo Epstein for a long time. He took over as general manager of the Red Sox at a very, very young age. And he broke at that until the Red Sox won the World Series in 2004. They had gone 86 years without winning the World Series. And there was this legend around the Red Sox, the curse of Bambino. In 2019, the owner of the Red Sox had sold Babe Ruth, the Bambino, to the New York Yankees. And the legend was he sold him in order to finance a Broadway play. And of course, the Yankees went on to win, dozens of World Series over the decades, and the Red Sox, just were mired in this 86-year drought. And so that was one of the things. I guess one of the things I wanted to say about this first effort that Theo Epstein led was he was a disciple of what was called Moneyball at the time. And if you may have heard the reference, there was a book called Moneyball and then a movie made about it. And Moneyball was about using data to look at decisions and personnel in Major League Baseball differently. The story was basically that the general manager of the Oakland Athletics, which was a team that had a lot fewer resources than teams like the Yankees and the Red Sox, he looked at, well, how can I gain a competitive advantage? And so he started looking at baseball statistics much differently, started drafting players based on things that other clubs and other organizations were not looking at, and was able to be very successful with that. Theo Epstein was very much a disciple of that thinking. He took that to the Boston Red Sox and combined kind of that new way of thinking about data with a lot more resources. And that was part of the reasons why he had this success in turning around the Red Sox. Well, in 2012, he left the Red Sox and he went to the Cubs, who had actually a longer drought. It had been, well, they went 108 years between winning World Series. And so with the Cubs, their curse was called the Curse of the Billy Goat. And I'll let you Google that if you want to learn more about what that is all about. But really, it was an organization that was mired in more than a century of just this concept that they could not win, whether it was the curse. They were sort of, the Cubs were branded as the lovable losers. And so, Theo Epstein very much looked at that as a great challenge to come. He did it once with the Red Sox. Could he do it again with an organization that had even a more difficult past and culture to deal with? And so many of the, like I said, so many of the lessons that we've talked about from our readings and whatnot during the semester show up in this story of how he turned around the Cubs. So I wanted to just talk about a few of those. So obviously there's the idea of the big, hairy, audacious goal, or the wildly important goal. It's pretty simple in sports. Your goal is to win the championship. And that was obviously part of it. He went to Chicago to help that organization win a World Series. But it was, I think, overcoming that stigma of being the lovable losers and that more than a century of failure kind of made that goal even a bigger thing than it would have been at any other organization. There was the idea of co-creation, and so the reading that you have this week starts with talking about a meeting that Epstein pulled together at the beginning of 2012 when he took over the job in Chicago. And so basically it was a 3-day strategic planning retreat. And I thought what was really interesting was that he really very much wanted to have the input of a lot of people. When he came to Chicago, to the organization, very much like when any new leader comes into an organization, a lot of people can assume that their jobs will be gone, they will be asked to leave. And that was the case with the Cubs organization. But Epstein did not do that immediately. He actually wanted to give people a chance to see if they could buy into the culture that he was trying to build. And so one of the things that you'll read in this reading is that he says Epstein wanted the input of every scout, coach, manager, and instructor in the entire Chicago organization. And he did that with this 3-day planning retreat. And you'll also, if you ever have an interest in reading the entire book, you'll find that they really brought the players into this co-creation as well and got them accountable for their own growth, their own development, their own actions, and their own behaviors. And so, one of the ideas there was that if you have people that are part of the planning process, when things get difficult, they can't just bail. They can't do the backstabbing and the bad mouthing of the organization because they were part of the process of creating that plan. And so, we've talked about that through the semester. Interesting to see how Epstein actually applied that in this very high stakes game. There's the idea of adaptive strategy, which is kind of what our whole course has been built around. You'll read in this chapter that what came out of this 3-day retreat was a 259-page document that had it was kind of a broad range, and obviously that document's not available. It's an internal private document, but the author of the book describes it to some degree, including a lot about culture and values and that type of thing, as well as some very minute details about things like how players were going to round first base. But one of the notes that is on page 1 of this document is this comment that rather than a how-to reference guide, this document should be considered a living, breathing document that will change over time as we continually challenge the status quo. And so I think that's an important concept to keep in mind that, again, a lot of organizations do strategy once and it's set in stone and they don't change it. But Epstein very much realized that, you know, what they came out of that planning meeting with definitely would change as they learned things, and they would always question whether what they were doing was the right thing and make changes if necessary. You very much see the idea of the hedgehog concept in part of this. The Cubs Way strategy provided focus and clarity by articulating very clearly what the values of the organization were going to be. And it also talked about what they were going to be best at in the world, which is one of those circles of the hedgehog concept. And interestingly, it wasn't that we're going to be the best at winning baseball games. You realize that was an outcome rather than a kind of an input. And so really what they determined that they were going to be the best at in the world was building and maintaining the best scouting and player development system in Major League Baseball. And so, the focus was very much on people, on growth, on learning, on development of players, coaches, everybody in the organization. I think that's a great focus for any organization. I know there's been talk about that here at the University of Montana. Actually executing on that is always a challenge, but clearly the Cubs did that, and it paid dividends. There was certainly some turning the flywheel. The turning the flywheel concept is that idea that big things happen when you do a lot of little things extremely well over a long period of time, and so Epstein's strategy was really to start his culture change and organization change at the lowest levels in the minor leagues, with the young players coming in and the coaches and personnel that were developing those players. And so, for several years, they were building that momentum through the minor leagues, while the major league team, the Cubs, they were still losing 100+ games a year, still not being successful. And yet, this book talks about, in the minor leagues, there was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of just momentum being built as people started seeing that they were being successful following some of these processes and the strategies and the values that had been set out in this plan. Epstein very much followed the concept, Collins's concept of first who's on the bus, where they're at on the bus. One of the things he did was he questioned the conventional wisdom in baseball that most franchises, most organizations believe that you built championship teams around quality pitching. That you had to, those were the anchors of your organization. So Epstein's approach was a little bit different. He built his organization, or his idea was to build his organization around some core position players, infielders, outfielders, who were very high character. And his thinking on that was that those players were going to be on the field every single day. He wanted those players to be the leaders of the team. Whereas pitchers typically are only pitching every fourth or fifth day. They're not always part of the day-to-day playing of the game, and so that was one way he thought about it a little bit differently. He also very much wanted to get a manager at the major league level that bought into his culture and bought into this player development mentality. He ended up pursuing Joe Maddon. So one of the things that is interesting here is that under this Moneyball concept, it had kind of become, again, conventional wisdom that the manager of the club was more or less just kind of a middle manager that implemented the strategy from above. They didn't really make decisions because the data made all of the decisions for you. You just followed what the data said you should do. One of the growth things that I think Epstein did between going from the Red Sox to the Cubs is he came to understand that, yes, data analytics is very important in decision making, but there has to be very much a human element to it. You have to understand the relationships and build those relationships, and so that was one of the reasons that he pursued Joe Maddon, because he knew he was a manager who had a reputation of being an outstanding communicator and teacher. He was also a manager. He was one of the very earliest managers. I think he was, in fact, the first professional manager to bring a laptop into the dugout and actually start to use some data to make decisions about where to position players on the field and those kind of things. And he was very much ostracized for that. So Epstein did appreciate that he had a manager who, was innovative, did pay attention to data and decision making, but at the same time was willing to basically go against that data if it didn't feel right. If he understood that, the data doesn't always tell all of the story, and so again, a critical part of the organization's success is strategy about who was put in leadership positions within the organization. There was, I think, very much the Stockdale paradox that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And that's that idea that, one, you have this faith that things will work out. It's not just blind optimism, because at the same time you are well aware of the and acknowledge the challenges that face you. And so I think one of the interesting things about baseball in particular is it is very much a game of failure. The best hitters in baseball fail 7 out of 10 times. And Madden, I think, as a manager, one of his kind of the brilliance of him was he understood how to help, especially young players, deal with that failure and have faith that they would be successful. And a big part of that was this faith in process. And I've talked about this a little bit, I think, in the past, in terms of making sure you have a strategic process, a creative process, and trusting that there will be a positive outcome out of that. The very first meeting that Madden had with the organization in the spring training of 2016, he had a number of things he talked about, but this was one of the things he talked about was, he had this slide, it was do simple better. And that was really about trusting the process. The process is fearless, it lacks emotion, it's in the moment, so on. And so that's something that he lived and breathed that every day throughout the entire season. One of the really interesting things is this is his scorecard on the very last day of the season. This is Game 7 of the 2016 World Series, Joe Madden's scorecard. There's all kinds of, I encourage you to Google this as well and read some of it. There's a website that can tell you what all of these little notations mean. But just a couple I wanted to point out is right at the top center there, I just circled DSB, do simple better. That's that reminder that of what he talked about on day 1 of the season. Over on the right upper part there, process. And so he had these reminders to himself in this highly pressure-packed situation that keep your eye on the fact that this is a process. We've been doing this all year. We're not going to do it any differently than we've been doing it every day. And so hopefully you've enjoyed that. A little bit of a story of an organization that, whether you're a baseball fan or not, like I said, I think you can learn a lot from looking at those kind of stories. I hope you've enjoyed the diversion, and have a safe and happy Thanksgiving, and we will talk again soon. Thanks.